The Axeman was what the papers ran with, and there are plenty of headlines and images and graphics that I took, some original illustrations depicting what might have happened at the time. Um, the Axeman was big news all across the United States at the time, and that's just what they were going with. Now, if you research the Villisca Axe Murders, there is a name, there's a suspect.
All right, we are joined today by Todd C. Elliott, who was recommended by Pete A. Turner of the Break It Down show. And Todd has written a book called The Axes of Evil. And it's not Axis. We're not talking about Iran and North Korea. No, we're talking about somebody who is completely crazy over 100 years ago that killed a lot of people in New Orleans. How are you doing today, Todd?
Hey, doing great. Glad to be here today. Wanted to promote the book because I think it's an important part of untold history, untold, unheard of American history, and possibly the largest unsolved serial killing in U.S. history.
Okay, so let's start up there. How many victims are there?
Well, I don't want to give too much of the book away, but from my count, according to my count, it was definitely over 50. And keep in mind that it was about 5 at a time, and sometimes there were even as many as 6 at a time. Now we're talking whole families, mom, dad, children, asleep in their bed in the middle of the night, axed to death. And this was actually the biggest news story in the United States in 1912, right up until when the Titanic sank in 1912. And the Axeman sort of disappeared from the headlines. Now, I know a lot of people will, when they think Axeman and they think the Axeman murders, they will think New Orleans. The New Orleans murderer was really a copycat killer that was several years later. Now, this started in 1912 and really instilled the fear in communities across Louisiana. And then later, we would see what was popularized by American Horror Story, the Axeman of New Orleans, synonymous with the Axeman's jazz and the jazz music, very much like a Jack the Ripper around the turn of the 20th century. But that would have been several years later. This was the original Axeman, and the story is far more horrific and horrifying than the New Orleans Axeman. But there are connections to New Orleans, definitely connections to Louisiana. And the reason I started writing this book was because one of the murders actually occurred in my hometown of Lake Charles, Louisiana. And that's kind of the way I start the book. I started with the murders that I knew best. And for me, I thought starting with the Lake Charles murders was significant because it was the only one whereas the killer left a message behind. Now, he slaughtered a family of 5 in their sleep with an axe and then left a biblical quote on the back door. The back door was found open on the morning of January 23rd, 1912. So the family, the family unfortunately met their demise at the hand of the Axeman on January 22nd, 1912. And, that family, just one of a slew of victims and families across the state of Louisiana and into Texas. And then we found out later, according to my research, that the murders in the South were probably connected to the Villisca, Iowa axe murders. And therein lies our suspect. So, what's interesting about the Lake Charles murders, the only message left behind by the killer, and the killer was definitely traveling the rails at the time and seemed to always pick the house within closest proximity to railroad tracks. The railroad tracks are still out there to this day, and with some of the murder sites, you can still see them. It's basically our virtual footprint for the killer. And the killer wasn't carrying an axe with him. Back then, there was no central air and heat. So during the winter, everyone had an axe out in their yard or their backyard to chop wood for fire. So this killer, known as the Axeman, would go to the victim's house in the middle of the night, find the family's axe out back near the woodpile, and then do his dirty deed upon the family. And while they slept, they became a statistic that is often forgotten in American history.
Okay, so to back things up, you mentioned, I think you said Iowa as well. Are you saying that this killer potentially started in Iowa and moved to Louisiana,
The
or
way yeah, the way I kinda clocked the patterns of the killer was he was what we would have called a snowbird. He would have traveled during the winter, he would have traveled through the South in the warmer climate, and then in the summertime, he would start killing people up north. And, that's a theory that I put forth, and I also have a suspect. Of course, I don't wanna give too much away, but what's interesting is during the fall and winter months of 1912 and 1911, we start to see the Axeman heading west into Texas. And the Villisca Axe Murders in Iowa were closer into the spring and the summer months. But I did not know of the Villisca Axe Murders, which is a popular tourist attraction, probably the biggest one in the town of Villisca to this day. But even people that I researched and contacted up there, they had no idea about the Axeman down here. And I'm thinking it's just a bigger picture of a spree that this killer was on at the time. And, victims, over 50 victims tallied. But this is really the first book devoted totally to this series of serial killings. And I like to think that I'm the first one to tie the Villisca Axe murders to the ones here in Louisiana and Texas.
now, hold on. Did this killer have a name? Because I'm already my head's spinning because of the Axeman in New Orleans. You're saying is a later copycat. So this guy was random Axeman. I mean, did he have a name, a moniker, a title?
The Axeman was what the papers ran with, and there are plenty of headlines and images and graphics that I took, some original illustrations depicting what might have happened at the time. Um, the Axeman was big news all across the United States at the time, and that's just what they were going with. Now, if you research the Villisca Axe murders, there is a name, there's a suspect. Now, nothing can be proven. Even though this killer did admit and confess to the killings, he still never served any time, and he still kind of got off scot-free without giving too much away in the book. What's interesting, though, is the Axeman seemed to be, for a while there, a woman. There was actually a woman arrested in Louisiana, and her name was Clementine Barnabette. And Clementine Barnabette was the main suspect. Now, you have to understand that all of the victims' families at the time were of African American descent at the time, and so the thing was, it was theorized that these were mixed race families at the time, and that there was a religious sect with connections to New Orleans from a church called the Sacrifice Church out of New Orleans that had links and ties to voodoo at the time. Clementine Barnabette somehow affiliated with this religious organization. In fact, when Clementine was arrested, she was arrested with two other black preachers or priests at the time, who were held for a short period of time until she confessed to the killings. The interesting thing about her confession is after she had confessed, the murders continued. So, in some way, Clementine Barnabette was exonerated, but it's an interesting part of American history, whereas we see, uh, possibly the first accused female serial killer, and there's still, murder sites where the victims, the families, met their end at the hand of the Axeman. They're still there to this day, still less than 50 yards away from the old railroad tracks that have been around for over 100 years. And some of the interesting things, though, that you would almost think that Hannibal Lecter would have had a hand in it because like in Silence of the Lambs, Hannibal Lecter was posing dead bodies, and we see this in Crowley, Louisiana, before the Lake Charles murders. So before January 22nd, 1912, small town of Crowley, Louisiana, a family of four murdered in their sleep. And then once they were dead, and I guess rigor mortis had set in, the killer, the Axeman, took the mother and father and posed them on their knees on the bedside, seemingly to pray. The killer positioned them in a prayer position while the children were brained by an axe and tucked in bed, uh, quite dead. The family of four, uh, definitely pronounced dead when it was discovered in Crowley, Louisiana. And what's interesting is I went back to the house where that happened, and the the family that still lives there to this day told me about a headstone that they found on the side of the house. Now, I couldn't make out the inscription on the headstone, but it's believed to be that of the family, that they might have been just buried on site on the family property at the time. It was a different cultural climate in Louisiana at the time, and but stemming from this church that was preaching almost like the purity of African blood, and the victims all seemed to be of mixed race. So the Church of Sacrifice was hugely suspect. There's definitely religious undertones throughout the whole thing. And, it was almost as if they were destroying or killing destroying the lives of the impure uh, African American families at the time. It
So
definitely
do you
instilling
think the
fear.
killer was African American?
I ultimately no, I
Okay.
don't. But that was what they were going with, and it seemed to be the sort of MO of the church. And at the time, you had a lot of uh, tent revivals traveling across the state of Louisiana. So this church out of New Orleans was definitely around, definitely suspect at the time of the Lake Charles murders.
Mhm.
And what is interesting though is everyone seemed to know where the killer was going next because everyone had figured out, especially the sheriff in Lafayette, Louisiana, figured out pretty quickly that the killer was traveling the rails and making his way further west. And so from Crowley, you head further west to Lake Charles, Louisiana, and coming with the Axeman were just hordes of traveling salesmen, hoodoo and voodoo uh, lightning rod salesmen coming to town on the eve of some of the murders, and they were selling lightning rods to put on your house to ward off the Axeman, to protect people, selling hoodoo charms and voodoo charms and things like that.
What is the difference between hoodoo and voodoo other
Okay,
than the song lyrics?
that is a good question, and I learned that by being a tour guide in New Orleans over the years. Voodoo is very much a religious belief that stems from West Africa, brought to Haiti and then to New Orleans in about 1789. So what you would get with voodoo is lighting of candles, worshiping of West African gods. Definitely a religious belief still practiced to this day in New Orleans. Hoodoo would have been more of what, say, white folks would have gone in for, superstitious beliefs, charms, talismans, what we have still to this day in Louisiana called gris-gris bags. And gris-gris is a French word, gris, meaning gray, sort of a mix of gray magic, a mix of white and black magic. And if you wanted to have a love spell or a charm or even do well in school, you can still purchase a gris-gris bag to this day and carry it around with you. But it was more of a sort of a spiritual, materialistic um, way of, the white community accepting a little bit of voodoo into their lives here in Louisiana. A lot of them, but some of them still to this day do actually go in for the deep religious practice of, the West African gods, including Legba, as the main sort of gatekeeper and focal point of that religion. And but it's still practiced to this day. But back then, to the newspapers and in the headlines, this was all scary stuff to the newspaper readers back in the day.
If I've always been of the impression that voodoo was a combination of the African religions and Catholicism combined.
Yeah, it very much became that because what you would do is, if you were a slave at the time in New Orleans, you would have, first of all slaves as part of the city of New Orleans under the French and Spanish rule at the time would have they all of your slaves had to be baptized Catholic, and then they had to attend church every Sunday, and every Sunday they would attend church in the morning, but at night it was a different story. In fact, voodoo was banned from the original city of New Orleans, which, if you are familiar with the French Quarter, at one time that was the entire city of New Orleans. In fact, the entire French Quarter was surrounded by medieval walls at one time, and those who practiced voodoo would have to exit the walls of the city and go out to a place that still stands to this day, Congo Square, Louis Armstrong Park out there. But Congo Square is still a sacred site for those who practice voodoo. And that is where, on Sundays, you would hear the drumming and chanting outside the walls of the city of New Orleans at night. But during the day, on Sunday, everybody was in church. And so, to some degree, I would say New Orleans voodoo is, and Haitian voodoo too, a mixture of Catholicism and the West African gods. Yeah.
Okay, interesting, interesting. Now, let's go look at these two killers again. We got the Axeman, the Axeman, or axe person, I guess. I want to be wide open about it, but I did ask deliberately if it might be African American because it's very rare. In general, serial killing seems to be a Caucasian activity. There are exceptions, but overall, if you look at all serial killers in America, it's something that white people seem to do. Um, this serial killer stopped around the time of the Titanic. You said 1912, and then just vanished. It, but it can't be the same killer as New Orleans. What makes you say it's a copycat?
No, it definitely was not the same killer. I mean, that's what I theorize. But my main suspect at that time would have moved on and would not have been in New Orleans at the time. But I was able to retrace some of the main suspect's footsteps. He definitely traveled rail. He was definitely in the South. Um, he was definitely in Villisca, and he was a preacher. So again, more religious undertones or overtones to the whole serial killing thing. But the Axeman murders had made such an impact in the community in the South at the time, across the country, so much so that the copycat killer in New Orleans, who wasn't nearly as heinous um, or prolific, kind of just rode the coattails of that name, the Axeman, and it worked. It worked for him, but this would have been about 7 years later. So we're talking, 5 to 6 years later, after 1912, you're seeing the Axeman's jazz, the Axeman murders, the one that's really popularized in American Horror Story, not till around 1919 or 1918, around that time. So yeah, and the real story of the true Axeman, the original Axeman, is far more horrific.
Okay, so on that, and by the way, you're making me think of another comparison. Did you know there was two Night Stalkers?
Oh, yeah, I had heard that theory, yeah, before.
Well,
Yeah.
I mean, literally, the Golden State Killer, who finally got caught, was originally called the Night Stalker.
Oh, right, right,
And
right.
then he kind of the name took, and then you had Richard Ramirez come along, and he became the famous Night
The
Stalker.
Night Stalker,
So,
yeah.
I don't know if this is a similar situation or not, but
Well, what is interesting, and it's also there's I kinda delve into Son of Sam too. There was always suspected that he didn't act alone, that there was maybe even a cult involved with the Son of Sam. In the book, when you read Axes of Evil, the true story of the Axeman murders, there was a signature to the biblical quote left on the back door of the Broussard family house in Lake Charles, and it was signed. It appeared to be signed by someone referring to themselves as the Human Five. And what was interesting was the victims, especially the children, their fingers were splayed apart with pieces of wood, and demonstrating the number five. And it was believed that Clementine Barnabette, the woman who was arrested, may have been just one acting party of a cult of axe killers, just on the loose. And maybe they further committed the crimes to exonerate her, but she ended up in Angola Women's Prison in Louisiana. Now, of course, she confessed, but back then, um, either she was insane, the killer was definitely insane, but we're seeing an affiliation with religious people, religious leaders, and there's a cult going around called the Human Five. Now, there's never been much else other than that in what I have in my book. So But it's kind of creepy to think that there was more than one, even in any serial killer case, that a serial killer or killers can work as a team. It's
Hillside
absolutely
Strangler,
horrifying. Yeah.
I believe, were the pair. Um, but you're right, it is very rare. So, do you believe that it is a cult or a single person, in your book?
Um, I yeah, initially I did. I think it was very possible that, just due to the times, 1911, 1912, sanitation wasn't really, very popular. There was a lot of lead being used, lead in the water, lead in hats. I mean, there was some mental disruption going on with at least one person, and this one person was a religious leader. Now, is it possible that he convinced a flock of people to commit murder? I do think that is possible. I wouldn't say that I like to think that there was a cult of crazed axe killers out there, but that was the belief at the time. And I will say that the main suspect in the Villisca Axe murders, he was a priest, he was a preacher, and he was staying in a family home as a guest, which you can actually still stay at the Villisca Axe Murder house to this day. I think it's an Airbnb, right? And now he claims that he was awakened in the middle of the night and that he saw a shadow that night on the front lawn of the family's house. And then he heard a voice tell him two words. Those two words were slay utterly. And he confessed all of this and he still got off. Now, the reason people think that he never was brought to justice, it was proven later that he was a member of a Freemason and, affiliated with the Masonic fraternity and fraternal organization. Now, that is possibly how he got off. Um,
So, we have
but what
2
is
confessions so far?
Yeah, exactly. So you do have two confessions. Um, One was arrested. Now, of course, the suspect in Villisca was a white man who was actually from England, maybe even inspired by Jack the Ripper from his youth. But something was definitely wrong with this individual, and a lot of people would say, well, maybe it was, just racism. It was just the KKK. But at that time in 1911 and 1912, where we start to see, the murders popping up, the KKK wasn't really it was a loose confederation, not really an organization at the time. But what is interesting is my main suspect, later, years later, would be affiliated with the New Jersey branch of the Ku Klux Klan.
Wow.
But yeah,
Now,
so
on that note, though, the other, Axemen in New Orleans, from my understanding, there's a racial component to that as well, that they did not like Italians.
right, and in that I think what you're seeing in New Orleans at the time, especially around right before 1920, the French Quarter was inundated with nothing but Italian and Sicilian families. And I think what you're seeing in the later Axeman, the Copycat, the Axeman's jazz and all that, that is probably the fledgling, you know, organization of crime, criminal, organized crime in New Orleans that was meant to do what it did, and that was to instill fear back in the day. And, yeah, that was one thing that they were prejudiced to, Italians and Sicilians at the time, which, most of the, prominent white families had moved out of the French Quarter, into, Uptown and places like the Garden District and places like that. So at the time, and in the location of some of that Axeman, you have the Marigny, which is just outside of the French Quarter, and that would have been mostly Italian, Sicilian families at the time.
Okay, um, question for you on this then, especially when you have multiple confessions, is it possible that they both could have done it? And,
Oh, yeah.
okay, so that's one of my questions. Another question is that you mentioned that the New Orleans, or Jazz Axe Man was a copycat. Out of all these murders, you're talking about a lot of them. You said like over 30. Could there have been copycats in that mix? Like, I'm I'm trying to say that what you're painting is a picture that everybody had an axe. Everybody, it's cold, bad weather, whatever. Um, hey, this is convenient. I just go get their axe. It's kind of, I guess, a modern version would be go to the kitchen and go to the knife block and find a knife. And um, is it possible because of forensic science, or there wouldn't be a ton of details at the time? Be like, well, they got killed with an axe. There's only so many ways that you can kill somebody with an axe. Could there have been other copycats? I guess.
I think so. I actually put a timeline in the book, whereas you'll see that, if anything, I wanted to spotlight this was an epidemic in the United States. I mean, maybe it was the readiness and the availability of the axe at the time, but there was a lot of axe murders going on at the turn of the 20th century, which I like to start my book off with. When people say the good old days, there really was no such thing. That's sort of a myth. What is interesting is I do think that the two confessions, the two people that stood trial for these murders did possibly know one another, and it was probably through a church, tent revivals at the time, the Church of the Sacrifice, definitely, and I tried to figure out, and it was theorized that how do you murder an entire family of 5 in their sleep without awaking one single member of the family? And we're talking about out of so many 30 different murder sites and homes, there was only one, documented survivor, a small child, up in Texas near the Arkansas border, was the only survivor to ever survive what they thought was the Axeman still. Um, but I do also think that these families might have been drugged at the time. There was some agent added to, and I theorized that it was probably food, because if you have these, you know, religious leaders and tent revivals and churches, they're gonna get close to families in the community. They're gonna invite them out to the tent revivals, and they may even bring food to less fortunate people. Now, it's also kind of theorized that that's who they were trying to take out, the less fortunate, the mixed race. And what's interesting about the Villisca Axe murders is there was a piece of food found on the bedside where the families were all, again, they were all murdered in their beds. They were all sound asleep, and no one seemed to rouse from sleep or slumber. And um, yeah, and so I put that in the book as well too. But very interesting how the main suspect did appear at many of the crime scenes, and you do get a look at 1912 forensics back then. And there's actually photographs in now they didn't do crime scene photos back then, but there's photographs of the murder sites, thanks to a traveling journalist at the time from the Daily Boston Globe, which thankfully he just happened to be in the right place at the right time. And there's photographs of Clementine Barnabette and those who were arrested at the time, and even my main suspect, who I really think did it, but I think he was acting under religious impulse to commit these murders. And in
So this is kind of odd with what you're describing. There was no sexual crime aspect to this,
Well, I
mm,
will say this: there are some people that theorize that they found uh, a big slab of pork belly one of the crime scenes, and this was in Villisca, where they found the piece of pork that was wrapped in cheesecloth by the bedside of the murdered family. Now, I deduced that it was either that's what was poisoned, that's, might have had formaldehyde in it or something at the time, something to knock the family out. I think the killer, who always left the axe behind, always in the bedroom, was trying to take the piece of pork with him as evidence, so maybe it couldn't be discovered forensically that it was poisoned. But he did leave it, and it's an interesting thing because they said that there was, like a puncture mark or something in the pork. It was, like a hole or something like that, and I figured that it might have been syringe back then. Syringes were a little bigger than they are today back then. So it might have been punctured with some type of poison. But there were those who say that the killer sexually gratified himself using the pork, as you're not supposed to use pork products. So,
That's a very odd thing.
yeah, it's
Okay.
very odd. The whole book is very odd.
I mean, what you describe itself just sounds unusual because it sounds like it's extremely bloody, extremely violent, but the people didn't experience that violence because they were knocked out.
Well, that's the thinking. There was also theories abound that some of the there at the especially at the Lake Charles murder site, there was a bucket under one of the beds. Now, this could have just been the family's, uh, bedpan or something like that, but it caught a lot of blood. And that detail, when it hit the papers, the press kind of ran with that there were voodoo rituals being conducted while these murders were taking place. Um, there's this cult that gave us a name at the Lake Charles murder, the Human Five. Nobody could figure out what that was at the time. There's a biblical scripture that's penciled on the back door of the home, and just a lot of odd circumstances. The whole thing is very odd, and I think it would make a very interesting Netflix series or streaming series. So if you're a producer out there and you're listening, hit me up, Todd C. Elliott, Axes of Evil. Us. And this is, of course, is through Trine Day Publishing. And there is talk. We would love to, because I don't think the public can get enough true crime. And the fact that this is kind of unheard of, I like to unearth forgotten history, especially when it comes to serial killers. We find them fascinating for whatever reason, because from mythology, we've always been, I guess, you know, in amazement at monsters, real monsters, but they really existed. And the Axeman was definitely one of these. And if he wasn't alone, even scarier.
All true. Now, you had mentioned the axis. Any theories on influence from Lizzie Borden on all of this and the trend?
No, I don't really know, because my main suspect was from England. I think he was probably inspired by Jack the Ripper, but Lizzie Borden may have just been another one of those instances of just mental dilapidation at the time due to lead in the water, unsanitary conditions, things like that. I can't really explain the Lizzie Borden thing, but she pales in comparison to them. I mean, she might have killed her family, but this Axeman killed numerous families, sleeping families in their bed, in the one place where in your home you think you're safe at night. And it was something that instilled so much fear across Louisiana and Texas at the time. People were accidentally, you know, killing one another. Actually, there were accidental shootings that took place because, anybody was out and about at night, it had to be the Axeman. And so there were some accidental deaths involved as well, but I count those as casualties of the Axeman as well.
Okay, well, and I brought up Lizzie Borden because you had mentioned being able to kill a family without disturbing. Technically, she either did or got close to it because her father was asleep. Assuming she did it, she was found not guilty. I just do want to put that out there. There were more people killed at the same time. So I didn't know if that, because that happened about a decade prior.
It was certainly trending back then. We'll say that. It was popularized by Lizzie Borden, so but who knows? As far as like being disturbed, she definitely was. So,
Allegedly. Again,
allegedly.
found not guilty.
No,
Oh,
I've heard the conspiracy theories about that too as well. Yeah.
all right. To close out, why are you certain that it's a copycat in New Orleans? What were the differences between your Axeman MOIs and the
Yeah.
Jazz Axeman?
Well, the New Orleans Jazz Axeman was really kind of playing on Jack the Ripper. He was writing to the newspapers. He was requesting that if people played jazz music at night, well, they would be safe. Well, the original Axeman didn't give you any warning whatsoever. And the victims, he was targeting a very specific, very different demographic at the time. Now, whether it be just racial prejudice or just bigotry or prejudice in general, um, there's a little bit of a difference, but I don't think that it was the same. First of all, it was several years apart, and just a different MO altogether. Whereas the Axeman would be silent and just slaughter whole families. We have instances of the Axeman in New Orleans where he wasn't quite as skilled and left survivors, whereas the Axeman only left one. There was only one child in East Texas that ever survived by running out of the house. So I even theorized that the original Axeman probably got started in about 1910 with a timeline of events that I post in the book. But it wasn't until 1911, the end of 1911 and into 1912, that he really honed his craft. This was a cold-blooded, calculated killer that seemed to know exactly what he was doing. The New Orleans Axeman, the jazz Axeman, kind of just was, I think, feeling his way out, if that's the way to put it, as far as a serial killer, and the number of victims just didn't really add up, and it seemed to be a different crime scene altogether.
All right. Well, perfect. Todd, we can find the book normally at Amazon. I'll put a link here in the description so folks can get it. It's a trying day book. And thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. Sure do appreciate it. It's The Axes of Evil, the true story of the Axeman murders.